Well, that didn't seem to actually work. So I missed Greg this week. So sorry, guys. You're not getting a good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's just me, Aaron Quinn, here with my man. I'm really excited about this guest co-hosting here with me tonight, Kendall Mirsky. Kendall, how you doing? We've had you on the show once, but not enough. How you doing, my man?
I'm great. I'm doing real well. I just got back from a trip back to Western New York from Rochester, so I'm back in Utah after visiting Western New York. So it's nice to get a little bit of spice back in my life with some Western New York. It's been too long since I've been there. It was like 2 years, so it's nice to be back, but it's also nice to be back home, in my comfort space. But also nice to be back on the Cover One Buffalo show. Yeah, it's been a minute since pre-draft, but yeah, now it's nice to bask in what we have with this roster. Knowing some more answers. We got all the answers at this point. There might be some moves here or there, and we'll probably jump into one of them with Tavon Austin, but there's not really much that's going to be shuffling around. I mean, we got what we have at this point.
Yeah, no, and let's talk about that for a minute here because we were talking about it a little bit off air. OTAs is a tough time, especially for a guy like you who puts in so much work postseason into this draft process, right? And that's a huge grind for the draft process. And then, free agency, draft, it's all over and the dust kind of settles. And there's still fun things for, fans to do, but for content creators, it gets hard. And you were talking like this time of year, I feel like becoming a content creator almost makes OTAs more difficult to swallow because it's just a kind of where I used to get more excited when I didn't make content of, hey, there's guys in helmets and there's pictures and I can think about the Bills again, where now it's like, man, these are really hard to talk about. It's all PR, right? Like you're hearing the best of the best from the press conferences. You're getting the best shots in the media availability. There are guys in shorts, like no one's making big mistakes. And so it's kind of a boring time of year. Get in on that.
I mean, yeah, it is a boring time of year. If you're a content creation kind of guy, it's boring in that regard because you got to get creative. You got to be,
right?
Yeah, you got to be creative with what you're doing because you're not getting like true football, like X's and O's type of content from OTAs. You're just okay, like cool. We see Josh Allen in shorts here, and that's about it. And we got some pressers, and you kind of dig into quotes from pressers and try to read into stuff from that regard. But no one's going to say anything bad about anyone on the roster. You really got to dig deep into those press conferences to sift out what's true, what's just being, praise your guys, give them confidence during the preseason, all that kind of stuff. It's literally the difficulty of making content during this portion of the office. It's why I started doing the Madden thing, why I started pumping that Madden cast. Cause it's like, there's not much happening right now. So maybe some virtual bills will get people excited, but people love OTAs. I mean, really getting the helmets back on and everything. It is exciting. It's exciting to see those rookies out there playing football, get acclimated to the team and everyone else in the locker room. It'd be cool if we could get some more like personable stuff out of that, like some of those things that they used to do during the season, like a little trivia thing before they go back into the locker room. Some little segments like that would be really fun for OTAs to spice things up. But yeah, OTAs they're a different beast. They're a different beast. You kind of got to make up more than what there really is shown to us as the public.
Yeah. What I will say, if you aren't already, I'm assuming that you're following Eric Turner and the Cover One accounts. If you're here at this channel watching us or listening to us on wherever you get your podcast, if you're not following Eric or the TikTok or anywhere he is, nobody in the business, and I can say this with pride of working with Cover One all these years, nobody in the business, and hi, Greg. I see that Greg caught us. He is not with us. He's traveling. He's over in your neck of the woods over in Phoenix, out in the desert somewhere. So maybe I'm going to replace Greg with Kendall. We'll see. We'll find out at the end of the show here.
Literally already said not to.
Yeah. Eric Turner does a really great job of taking small clips, either that, news guys, media guys that are posting out there or stuff directly from the Bills, and year in and year out, he finds stuff. I will have watched that same video 4 or 5 times and he will find something. He'll pull up a Aaron Cromer 2017 tape where he shows exactly what the Bills are doing and practicing and explain how that's practicing. So while we're sitting here saying there's not a whole lot, if anyone's doing it and finding those little investigative details, it's our guy, Eric Turner. So make sure you're following everyone here at the Cover One family, everyone on the Cover One network here. And definitely make sure Eric's one of your top follows, because he's going to find any little nugget to get out of there and explain to you what the Bills are actually doing in these practices and what's going on this time of year. But outside of OTAs, there's always fun news because the NFL is full time, baby. It's all year long. We got a little bit of news this week that was somewhat Bills related. Ryan Fitzpatrick here in the last week here has retired. He texted Fred Jackson. Fred Jackson came out and broke the news. How much more Billsy is that than having Fred X retire Fitzy to the public? Ryan Fitzpatrick played 55 games from 2009 to 2012 for the Buffalo Bills, went 20-33, which is pretty droughty. That's pretty much par for the course of drought quarterbacks. He threw for 11,000 yards, 11,654 yards, which is 5th all time for the Bills, 80 touchdowns, which is 4th all time for the Bills. Talk about Fitzpatrick. You're a little bit younger than me, so you really came up in that middle of this drought era.
Yes.
And what's Fitz mean to you in that sense of growing up into the drought?
It's wild, but Fitz was like the first semblance of quarterback competency that I really
offensive
experienced.
competency, right? Yeah.
It really was like that Chan Gailey offense, as wonky as it was at times, and as often as it sputtered and stuff like that. Like it really was the best offense I had seen in Buffalo in my lifetime to that point. I mean, yeah, we had those deep balls from JP Lossman to Lee Evans and all that,
right.
But I mean,
those were Marshawn Lynch mixed in there. Yeah.
Right. But that was short lived and all that stuff. So really Fitzpatrick, like what it means to me and what it means to Buffalo is kind of really seeing kind of like, I guess the forest amongst trees, or kind of like that sunshine of just like, oh, there is a glimmer of hope here. There is like a chance. It doesn't take much to be that competent. We just got so used to being
it was bad,
awful, just bad on offense, and incompetent is the best word to use. But it really doesn't take. And Ryan Fitzpatrick will speak to this. Like he talks about how he has accepted like being a bridge quarterback, being a vet guy, like all this stuff. He knows his place. He knows who he is. He knows that he's someone that's capable of starting, but he's not some sort of superstar in this league. He just understands how to work what he has and play to his strengths. And yeah, what he means to me is really showing that there is a chance in Buffalo. And he was the beginning of that chance where it led from him to Tyrod, and then here we are now with Josh Allen. So he was really that beginning of kind of seeing the tides turn for me, because sure, it wasn't great, but there were some good moments with Fitz. Like we had a couple, maybe only one, but I want to say a couple New England upsets with Fitz. Like there were some good moments with Fitz. There were some good offensive games. There were some great complete games. It was just the consistency overall with those teams that was really the problem. It wasn't necessarily Fitz, and Fitz had to play hero ball to an extent a lot of the time. And that was his downfall to some extent with the
Bills. The Chan Gailey team, picking the defensive coordinator was his biggest hurdle that he was never able to quite figure out, that was the frustrating part. Being a little older during that time of the drought, so many years of like really good defenses, and the offense just couldn't generate anything. Then you finally get Shannon here and you get some weapons and a more creative offense, and they were able to score points more on par with the rest of the league. And you could see the league turning into an offensive league. So you're like, okay, they're on to something, but then the defense just fell. You never have the balance of the two. So I agree the inconsistencies there. But one last question on this Fitz thing is, in your opinion, is Fitz a Wall of Famer for the Buffalo Bills at any point?
I don't think so. I really don't. I think we kind of get too liberal with throwing Wall of Fame names up there. You know, just anyone who's been good during the drought years, he deserves to be on the Wall of Fame. Fitz was great for what he was in Buffalo. Like I just went 2 minutes talking about how great he was, but and the stats you pulled too, like he is up there in terms of all-time quarterback play.
Longevity a little bit though.
Right, exactly. So
although it's crazy to say it's longevity when he didn't play here that long. That's how bad the Bills quarterback situation was, that two starting seasons is longevity.
The one player I would go to bat for being on the Wall of Fame from the drought years, I think, is Fred Jackson. I think that's the only one. And like, it's still a stretch. It's a stretch.
Any drought player,
any drought player, I think it's tough. Who would you put up from the drought?
From the drought era? Well, technically Molds, right?
Okay.
Was drought era. So I think he would get there. I think Aaron Schobel might deserve to be on the Wall of
Those are
Fame.
both
He's
yes.
second in all-time sacks for the
Yeah.
team, and he ended his career early. I think he could have had another
Super
10
underrated player.
maybe. I see a scenario for Kyle Williams, although he maybe similar to Fred Jackson in terms of who he was as a player in the league.
Right.
Fred for me is another longevity one. Like you look at his all-time rushing yards for the Bills, and he had one really good season, but the rest of it was that the fact that he was on the team for so long, running the ball, where a lot of guys were just in and out. I don't think the case is there for him, but yeah, I think Molds, Schobel, definitely, maybe Kyle Williams. But yeah, no,
like
Fitz is definitely not. I think have Fitz as a legend that waves everybody in, do all that stuff, have him around the team as much as possible, do a bunch of media with him. That's fantastic. Let him retire, Bill. That's cool too.
Yeah.
That's where I stop, and that's where I draw the line.
That's fair.
And continuing, we're going to draw the line on talking about him. Another thing that I wanted to talk about here this week is PFF put out a coaching list, top 10 PFF coaching list here. And I don't agree with any of it. And I want to read it to you here. Not shocking that I don't agree with PFF. So this list, from my understanding, I read a Buffalo News article about this list saying that they broke down all these analytics and basically used how much salary cap went into which side of the ball and how much growth was on either side of the ball. And if it's Sean McDermott, if he's a defensive coach, they're not going to give him as much credit for how good that side of the ball was as how much does he impact the other side of the ball. All these things, overanalyzing things and not taking all the context to come up with some solution. So what they had for best coaches in 2020, and the way I took this was going into the season, which is why I had beef with it. I wasn't thinking of like all time how they've been. They have Bill Belichick, number one. John Harbaugh was number two. Andy Reid. I have no problem with John Harbaugh and Andy Reid here at 2 and 3. Cliff Kingsbury at number 4.
This is where it gets weird.
Yeah, it gets a little weird. Pete Carroll at number 5, which I don't get. Matt LaFleur at number 6, which I think is probably maybe actually a little low. Kyle Shanahan, 7. Mike Vrabel at 8. Frank Wright at 9. And Mike McCarthy cracks the top 10 of NFL coaches according to PFF. If you ever were questioning whether or not your data set or how you were coming up with something was broken, Mike McCarthy being in the top 10 of coaches should be a clear indicator that something in whatever algorithm you've put this in, something's wrong in this algorithm and you should throw it out and start again. I can live with some of these other guys like being in this top 10. I think that the areas are wrong, but you left out Sean McVay, Sean McDermott, and Mike Tomlin. There's probably other coaches that might be deserving to be in this, but am I a homer for thinking that Sean McDermott absolutely deserves to be in the top 10 NFL coaches going into 2020?
No, I don't think you are. I think the 3 names that you just listed, I think those 3 names deserve to be in. I think really where I said like right at 4, it gets weird. Like why Cliff Kingsbury, if you're talking about all time or even going into 2022, based on their track record in the NFL in their career, why is Cliff Kingsbury in there? It makes no sense.
Falling apart. There's a thing with him that he falls apart in the second half of seasons, going back to college. Like,
yes, exactly. It makes absolutely no sense. I don't get him being in there, let alone being number 4. That doesn't make sense to me. We already talked about the Mike McCarthy stuff. I mean, people rip apart Mike McCarthy for his game management, clock management, all of that kind of stuff. They're like Frank Wright.
And he's
Mike
had super
Vrabel,
talented teams in his career.
Yes, and hasn't lived up to that at all. Pete Carroll, Frank Reich, Mike Vrabel, Kyle Shanahan, Matt LaFleur. I like all of those coaches, but
I think the game's passed Pete Carroll by a little bit.
Pete Carroll being 5 is a little too high to me. I think he deserves to be top 10 for everything that he's done. But where he is like entering 2022, I don't think it makes sense for him to be 5th. I think Kyle Shanahan deserves to be higher on this list. I think LaFleur, I think he's a great coach, but I wonder if he's riding the coattails of Aaron Rodgers. That's a legitimate concern of mine. And then, of course, Tomlin, McVay, and McDermott.
Tomlin's been doing it now, 18 years of over 500 records or something like that.
Yeah, he deserves to be in this wholeheartedly, and that's coming from 2 Bills fans. Like we should not want Mike Tomlin in this list, but objectively, he deserves to be in the top 10 for head coaches. It's just ludicrous. Yeah, this list is wild. I think Yeah, you're overanalyzing. I think that's a great way to put it. I think you look at who the coaches are, what they're getting out of their players, and then objectively looking at their win-losses. Because obviously, you look at win-losses, there's a lot more that goes into each win and
Totally.
each loss, injuries, all of that kind of stuff. But win-loss is a good starting spot. It's a good way to just start your analysis. You don't need to get too deep on salary cap stuff and how the spending turns into development and all that. That's a GM's job.
There's
that
a
doesn't
lot that
fall
goes
on the
into
head
it,
coach. So I think it was
And
peak overanalyzing.
one thing you cannot, this is one of my biggest issues with the analytics community, is there's parts of football that you cannot quantify, right? Like people will talk about momentum's not a real thing. I don't believe that for a second. And it is a real thing. It exists in games. You can't quantify it. Another thing would be the Bills organization, what they were prior to Sean McDermott and Brandon Beane arriving. And people made fun of it, the talk of the process, the talk of culture, all these things that they were really hammering home for those first couple of years. That stuff matters. It really turned around a otherwise not necessarily a poverty franchise, but man, the butt of every joke in the NFL. Whenever people wanted to make fun of a team, it was the Bills and the Lions or those easy teams. The Bills aren't that anymore. And part of that was a changing of culture, which can't be quantified. The amount of moves they made to dump guys that weren't fitting the process, that weren't part of the process going forward, none of that can be quantified. And so I think a guy like Frank Wright has a lot of that. A guy like Mike Vrabel brings a lot of that to the table. So I'm cool with them being in the top 10, but then for you to leave Sean McDermott out, who maybe has had one of the biggest turnarounds and ending the longest drought in sports at the time, and turning the Buffalo Bills now into a Super Bowl contender, the favorite by almost every estimation, you're not going to give that coach a crack into the top 10. Like, that's crazy. The guy that just won the Super Bowl, his team won a Super Bowl. Yeah, he made mistakes along the way. You're not going to get Sean McVay in there. Like, he's been to multiple Super Bowls as a young coach. Like, it's pretty ridiculous. I'm very upset about it. I could probably do this whole show yelling at PFF about this list, but I think it's what they want, is for us to get mad and talk about this. So I'm going to continue on here. So we're going to move on to the point of the show where here, before we get to the positional previews, we're going to talk about OTAs. I know we just talked about how boring they are. I don't know how much you've been paying attention here to OTAs over the last few weeks. I haven't gleaned much outside of what Eric's shown me in his Twitter about the practices or any of the videos that have come out. And I try to take some of the stuff people say with a grain of sand, but we did have 3 press conferences here early this week. Brandon Beane, Smiley, and Frazier all spoke. We finally got the other coordinators. We heard from Ken Dorsey a week ago. Were you able to listen to any of those pressers? And if so, what did you get out of any of them?
So I haven't listened to a ton of pressers. I listened to the Leslie Frazier presser.
I love Leslie Frazier pressers.
He's awesome. He's so authentic. I listened to that one in prep for Film Room yesterday, and I've done some stuff. Like, most of the stuff I've consumed has honestly been via Cover One. Like you said, the stuff from Eric, and then the stuff that Anthony has been doing the last 3 weeks covering OTAs on Disguised Coverage. So that's the most of it. But specifically to the Leslie Frazier stuff, yeah, he was so unbelievably authentic, from how he talked about Kyer Elam, needing him to step up early and often, and being really forthright about how they need contributions from him early because of obviously his caliber of draft pick, but also what's going on with Trey. And then to double down on that, continuing to praise Dane Jackson, like not just him, like we've seen this in the past, Brandon Beane last year on the Chris Collinsworth podcast. And then of course, Sean McDermott, like, time after time after time, Dame Jackson is getting praise from this coaching staff or this front office. So I think those two things coupled together, it's very interesting and kind of telling that it seems like they're kind of trying to brace the fan base for Trey possibly not being ready for week 1, and that they need those young guys to contribute right away. But then secondly, on that, in that interview, him talking about Boogie, Groot, and AJ was awesome. That him talking about them all needing to take steps, and then specifically the step of consistency, that they can depend on them, because that's the biggest thing that's going to separate a guy like AJ Epinesa from Jerry Hughes and Mario Addison. You know what you're going to get from those guys week to week. Sure, you might not know what you might not know the top end is higher than what AJ Epenesa's top end could be, but you know that their bottom end, that floor, isn't going to drop you in terms of your level of play and what could happen from a play-to-play basis. You know what you're getting from those vets. And I think that's ultimately the thing that's hampered AJ Epinesa to this point in his career.
Definitely.
And you could say the same for Boogie and the fact that he didn't even dress a whole lot last year. So I think it'll be interesting to see how those three young guys will progress this year and how much consistency we'll have to do with that, because they are going to have to depend on those guys more this year than they have in the past, just based on what's on the roster.
Yeah, it's a interesting conversation that comes up a lot in my time now as a content creator. Levi Wallace is probably the biggest example of where fans and coaches seem to have a split of, hey,
Yeah.
or Isaiah McKenzie, I think, is another good one on the opposite side of the spectrum, where you see big plays, right? But you don't see necessarily the consistency. And for coaches, I always try to explain, like, it's really, everything's on the line in the NFL. And the
Yes.
margins are so small between good teams and bad teams, and victories and losses. It could be a number of plays. And so, yes, you want those splash plays, right? Like, why you go get a Von Miller, right? You want those big plays that are, again, game-changing plays. Frazier brought it up with Tremaine Edmonds. He needs to provide more of that to the team as well, right? You want these big plays, but at the end of the day, I love what Frazier said, that, you know, going into a game, you want to know what to expect. And Sean McDermott talks about it all the time. Control your controllables. And so if you have a guy that's a high variance player where, yeah, he can make big plays, but man, we just don't know. He could come out and lay a dud of a game and be the weak link. I'd rather have a consistent player, a Levi Wallace, a Jerry Hughes, that we know exactly where we're going to get the good and the bad, and we can play around that. And but we know where the floor is, and it's going to stay consistent. So I agree. I love the authenticity of that point. I also love, you mentioned this Dane Jackson, that they are praising him a little bit. And I do think some of that is to get his confidence up, that they probably feel they're going to have to rely on him at some point this year, probably early. But it's not like they're just always, you know, a guy like Leslie Frazier is always coming out into the media and always praising guys, because then you saw him. This is not the first time this offseason we've heard a Bills staff member get up to the podium and tell basically to the media, AJ Epinesa needs to take a step forward. Like, this is it. He has to do it. So they're not scared to use that platform to continue to push guys either. So it's not like all fluff that they're just saying, hey, Dane Jackson's looking good. We feel good about him. His confidence, the reps he got last year are paying off and showing true. It seems like they actually have some truth in it. We all see AJ Epinesa needs to get better. They see it as well, and they're going to put it out there in the media. And man, I don't know that there's a Bills player right now in the roster that is like more on a hot seat than AJ Epinesa, because they loaded up some depth at that position. They've got young guys there as well. Like, this could be an easy one to just walk away from if he just doesn't get it. And the consistency isn't there. And I'm very low on him taking that step. There's a few guys I think are going to continue to take these steps. I've seen nothing that tells me AJ is going to take a step forward. I think that it might just kind of muddle away here as a mediocre rotational lineman.
Yeah, that's definitely the fear, that he will just ultimately be a rotational guy and he won't be anything more than that. But I think the great point to it that Leslie touched on was that Miami Dolphins game, how much he flashed in that game, and how that high end of game and that confidence that he played with in that game, they need to see it week after week after week, because if they see that or even marginally worse than that week after week, he's better than rotational. He could find himself as a fringe starter or a solid starter in this league for multiple years, but he needs to find that consistency. It doesn't need to be to that level of play, but if he can get close to that, it'll do so much for his game moving forward through his career. One player I would like to add, I think the only other player, it's a little different because it's not like spending at the position, with a similar type of hot seat, probably Cody Ford. In terms of like,
yes, I'm already out on Ford, but
well,
I agree.
That's
He's right.
Totally fair.
I agree with you. And if there's any sliver of hope that I will say, I'm not maybe totally out on Ford, because if there's anything that can resurrect this, I think it's Aaron Cromer can come in and turn this thing around. So there is that chance. I see where fans see that chance, but I'm having a tough time even considering him as part of the future. I feel like that door closed for me, but maybe Aaron Cromer can turn it around. Let's hope so. These are the things, Greg and I say it all the time, these are the ones I love to be wrong on. because if
Yes.
I'm wrong, then the Bills have benefited. So
Yes.
I hope I'm wrong on this. I'm not trying to dunk on Cody or anything like that. A couple other pressers. So you just watched the Frazier one. I watched Smiley's today, and one seems cool. I mean, we're probably not going to hear from him again for the rest of the year. Special teams coordinator, has a good amount of experience. I'm happy for him to finally get a head coaching job. The only thing two things that I got out of his press conference, he sort of talked about this, Matt Hawk and Areza, and they're splitting those reps 50-50 at this time. And I know people have written articles and there's been talk about a competition. I think it's bogus. Like, I don't know if you feel the same way. I don't feel like there's a competition here. I know that you don't have to stay attached to a 6th-round pick. I know the Bills haven't stayed attached to a 6th-round pick in the past, but you still drafted a punter, and you don't have to draft that position. And I know they've thrown those picks away in the past, but I don't know that I think taking that punter means, look, thank you. And we know how Brandon Beane felt about the punting last year. We know how, we knew he was going to address this. And so everything in my gut is telling me this isn't a real competition. This is just for the sake of, Sean McDermott says everything's a competition. You have to earn your right. But to me, it's all for show. Do you feel the same way?
I do. I do ultimately think they have to keep up appearances. They can't say all of this stuff and that and not support it in pressers or on the practice field. They have to do everything they can to keep up those appearances and stay true to that word of we're gonna give everyone a fair shot at this, a fair competition at this. But I do ultimately agree. Like, punter is not a position you have to draft. They could have gone with one of the undrafted guys and given them a shot to beat out Matt Hawk, but yeah, at this point, you talked about how Beane was upset with the punting last year. He expressed that over the offseason. He expressed some praise for Matt Hawk, but it was really a lot about how, he had a down year and we can't have that again. And he was a great holder and it did great stuff for Bass, but you went ahead and you grafted a 6th-round punter who has perhaps the biggest leg in this draft class. So everything tells me they're going to give Areza every single chance he has to make this team. They're going to give him a longer leash than what Matt Hawk has. So I think it is for show for the most part.
Yeah, I agree. The one thing I did get that, in my opinion, was like a kind of cool insight, because we know about it and we talk about it on game day, but he talked about it from the perspective of a special teams coordinator in the NFL constructing that active game day roster. Right.
Oh, yeah.
And like those conversations between defensive coordinators, and you're like, okay, this guy can do this on defense, but we really need him here on special teams. Like, and how do you get down to that end of the day? Because honestly, special teams is probably the most impacted by those final decisions of those active roster spots. And a lot of times you're switching out some key special teams guys to maybe get a little bit more something. If you're activating Isaiah McKenzie and he's not returning kicks, you're losing a special team spot because he's not playing special teams otherwise. And so that kind of, the war games behind the scenes of how you develop that roster. And he talked about the workload that goes into getting those simple decisions figured out is unbelievable. And then another thing, John Warrow, a friend of the shows here, tried to get him to comment on the 13 seconds debacle last year. And he was kind of like, we moved on. But I think he brought up a good point too, in that, everybody's looking for that person to blame in situations in the NFL. And it's just never that clear. There's so much communication. There's so many things so many points of communication that there's rarely ever like one blame. And while the coach is the head coach and he'll take the blame ultimately, but it's never just that clean and simple. And I like that answer. I think that was the most maybe clear answer that we've had from anybody. I'm sick of hearing about that question. I don't really care anymore. I'm on to this year, but if you're going to ask it, I thought that was a good response to it.
Yeah, that's a great response.
Beane just kind of talked about the process they went through in hiring. The one thing I really liked about this was we heard about the new analytics hires from the Bills. And I think a lot of people think when it's an analytics or in addition to an analytics team, or you heard about the Bills, becoming robust in the analytics side of things. I think everyone just applies that to fourth down, when to throw, when to do all those things, which is a big part of the analytics thing. But Beane talked about this hire specifically being more on the the health side and the wellness side of what they're trying to do there, and managing practice reps and managing players throughout the game. And we've sort of heard these conversations before and how they ramp players up through the season. We heard about it a little bit with Cole Beasley last year, and that they, weren't necessarily going heavy on the targets for Stefon Diggs, knowing that they would have to ramp and have a long run in the end of the season. So it's interesting because we fight over PFF grades. And when we think of analytics, it's just charts and data about football, but there's a whole level of analytics that goes on behind that is taking care of the players and getting every single inch of competitive advantage out of the players. And I thought that was interesting.
No, that's super interesting. Yeah, there's so much that can be done to prevent injuries in terms of workload and all the technology now. I think it's Catapult that has those those vests that they wear,
Correct,
all of that stuff, player tracking, how much they're exerting via practice, all of that stuff. It's very interesting stuff, but it's also super valuable. It is so valuable to the team. I mean, obviously that's not going to prevent a fluke injury like the ACL tear to Trey White, but it could mitigate maybe the fatigue that his knees have in a game, and it could make him stronger.
If you can control individual dehydration alone, avoiding the injuries that come from that type of fatigue. I think it's huge. One thing where analytics probably doesn't need to exist in that type of way is if you've ever come on and some of these games last year in the post-game show, Greg and I talked about our heart rates from our iWatches, and you can see during the game it just skyrocket. It's terrible. That the Kansas City game, mine was like all over the place.
Time, just up and down.
Sometimes you don't need to see the data. I'm telling you. All right, let's get into why people are here. We are here to continue on our positional preview show. So if you haven't caught any of the shows over the last couple of weeks, we are going through position by position, just kind of, now that the dust has settled from the draft, free agency, going through, just kind of refreshing everybody as we get ready for training camp, and kind of talk about how we see these positions either changing for the better or worse throughout the year. So we're going to get right into it with the wide receivers. This top half of the wide receivers, this could go pretty quick. This is easy. Stefon Diggs is really fantastic at football. He's, in my opinion, I'm going to go out on a limb and say, I think he's arguably the most talented wide receiver in the NFL right now. I think I can make a case that he's probably the best well-rounded receiver. I'll go a step further, and I'll take heat for this on Twitter because I know the Bills have had a lot of great wide receivers in their history. I think Stefon Diggs is the most talented, best all-around wide receiver that's ever worn a Buffalo Bills uniform, and I'll defend that, and I'll put that up on a hill, and I'll die on that. I think T.O. had a better career. He's a Hall of Famer. Right. He did more things, but I'm talking about in a Bills uniform. I've never seen anyone be as well-rounded as Stefon Diggs, so I'll go there. And just real quick before I get your takes on Diggs, last year, 1,225 yards, 10 touchdowns. Pretty nice season. In just 33 games here so far with the Buffalo Bills, he has 2,760 yards, which is good for 14th all time. That's 2 seasons, and he's already at 14th all time on the Buffalo Bills list. Hopefully with this extension he's got, we're going to see many more seasons like this for him. He's got 18 touchdowns, which is good for 15th all time. He has 83.6 yards per game, which is good for first all time in Buffalo Bills history of wide receiver. The next closest wide receiver to him is Sammy Watkins at 17.1, which is 17.1 less. He was 66.5 yards per game. So almost a whole 20 yards per game better than anyone else on this list. And over the past 2 seasons, Diggs has been fourth in the NFL in targets per game at 10, behind Devontae Adams, who's at 10.6. So he is right up there with the Alphas. This was a conversation that we had a lot last year of, they're not targeting Diggs enough. They're not targeting like a true wide receiver. I even had an argument with somebody that's like, target him the same way the Packers target Adams. And they do. He is a legitimate alpha number 1 wide receiver who's going to get around 30% of your targets, locked and sealed. What do you got to say about Diggs?
I'm gonna jump off a few things that you said. Firstly, I'll go kind of like backwards, I guess.
Yeah.
I can't believe, looking back at the numbers retrospectively, it did not feel like he got targeted as much as he did when we were watching the season. But he did. He objectively did. So anyone that felt like he wasn't getting targeted enough, I was there too. He did. He just objectively did. And then going back even more, I'm really happy you're the one to go on this hill about Diggs being the best wide receiver in Bills history to wear Bills uniform.
Most talented.
Okay, that's better. That's better put. but I'm glad that you're the one that did it because you're older than me. So you have more
Oh,
legs
you
to
never
stand on
saw.
there. Yeah, exactly. If I say something like that, it's like, oh, you're like 6 years old, dude. You don't get
Yeah.
it. But and then also well-roundedness. I think that's the crux of this argument for you in general with Diggs. Like, he is super well-rounded. There's no true weakness to his game. I think coming out, people questioned his speed. And I think, sure, that might not be a strength of his, but it's not a weakness. It's not holding him back. He doesn't struggle to stack cornerbacks and get deep on guys. He does it in a different way because he's such a great route runner and he understands how to pace his routes. He doesn't run them at 100% speed. He knows to
Right.
pace the stem, and he knows how to play leverage, get in the blind spot, all of that stuff. He's a super, super well-rounded guy. Personally, I'm not going to put him as number one in the league, but man, it's hard
I
to
think there's
take
an
him out of
argument.
top 5. Oh, there's easily an
It's like
argument.
him,
Don't get me wrong.
Adams,
Yeah.
Cooper Kupp.
Yeah,
They're
you
all right
can
there.
have an argument for putting him in the top wide receiver position in the league all day. There's no reason to not have that argument, but it is an argument because
Sure.
there's just absolute great talent at this position, and it gets even more talented year after year. But
Yeah.
specifically to Diggs, and I think I want to take it more in the contract realm because I think there were some people that were kind of like a little butthurt that we gave him the money we gave him, and he's yeah, because he's 29 years old, and it's like, oh, he's almost on the wrong
age.
side of 30. Exactly. He's the potential out for this contract is right before he turns 32. So it's after his year 31 season, and you just put it perfectly. The way he plays the position already at age 29, it's in a vein where it doesn't matter that he's going to age. People talk about, oh, the Chiefs might have done a great thing by getting rid of Tyreek Hill now before he loses a step because everything Tyreek Hill does is predicated on his speed. As you get older, you lose speed. Diggs doesn't rely on that as much. It's kind of the same way where, Vince Carter had to mold his game in the league from being this high-flying, slashing dunker to someone that can be a spot-up shooter. He had to mold his game. People like Steph Curry, he's not going to have to mold his game. It's already molded to be an aging vet. Ray Allen, that kind of same vein. Stefon Diggs is that. He plays the wide receiver in a way that's going to age gracefully, and it shouldn't be a concern. The contract is through his age 34 season. There's a potential out after the age 31 season, but I think we're going to be A-okay with the money we gave him relative to the output we're going to get from it.
Yeah, and a couple things on that note. Follow Diggs on Instagram. I don't know that there's anybody that treats and works on their craft and their body more. Like, you see him doing the route running. I think everybody sees that. The things that don't get shared are the dude doing acupuncture all the time, doing the hydrochrome, whatever therapy, the new therapies out there all the time. And then the Buffalo Bills have invested a ton of money. We just talked about the analytics additions in trying to improve health and trying to get those numbers so to put out good ramping up for players and trying to prevent injuries. And then you have the facility itself to, come be the best version of yourself and, manage your injuries here. So I think if you were a player that's aging, I think this is also a good point for Jordan Porter and Micah Hyde as they age at their positions. I think they're also the type of athletes that will age gracefully, but I think the benefit of the Buffalo Bills and how much money and time and resources they're putting into the, wellness side of football, I think will pay dividends for a guy like Diggs. And I agree with everything you said that, his style just to me seems like he'll be just fine as he ages out of this. We're going to get into not an unknown here, but I think a little bit less known, obviously the commodity that we have in Diggs. Gabriel Davis, huge playoff performance last year. And he's had some big time games in the playoffs. And it seems like he has ramped up the last 2 seasons towards the end of the season, but he hasn't been able to solidify that number 2 role early in the season. Last year, obviously, they brought in Emmanuel Sanders. There's a little bit of that vet edge that Sanders probably got in that deal where he was maybe guaranteed at least a shot to have that job, but he did pretty well with it. Sanders had a pretty good start to the season, and Gabe Davis slowly, as he was able to come in with that Sanders injury, just showed he had a little bit more to offer than an Emmanuel Sanders did, right? And again, well-rounded. big physical dude. He can burn. He doesn't look like a guy that's going to burn you, but he can take the top off a defense. And the thing to me that makes all the difference in the world is his willingness to be a team player, blocking, getting in there and blocking. Like that is such an underrated skill set for a receiver, a Robert Woods type number 2 wide receiver, where he's willing to get in there and do the dirty work. We saw him last season, 549 yards, 6 touchdowns, plus his playoff performance, which was an additional 242 yards and 5 touchdowns on top of it. And unbelievable. Is Gabriel Davis this year going to solidify himself as not just a, number 2 wide receiver that you can depend on, but is he going to be like a name in the NFL that is a true number 2 wide receiver where people say, hey, Diggs and Davis, like this is one of the best you got in the league? Because that's how some Bills fans are talking.
I don't want to go on that limb and say that, but I think I will. I think everything we've heard about Gabe Davis, everything that's been covered by or surrounding Gabe Davis this offseason, when it comes to like Bills Embedded or like anything behind the scenes, it talks about his professionalism and his willingness to get better, his work ethic. He understands what he needs to work on, where he needs to grow, what he's already great at, and how to couple that into being the best version of himself. But it's really hard to root against this guy or really even say that this guy isn't going to be a great number 2 wide receiver. I don't think he's ever going to be a number 1 wide receiver. I don't, but I do really believe that he has all of the potential in the world to be a wide receiver 2 in this league. I don't want to go out on a limb and say that he's going to be like a fantastic wide receiver number 2 and he's going to be like one of the best wide receivers in the league or anything like that. But I think he's someone that's ultimately going to have a complement. He's not someone that's going to draw coverages. He's the guy that's going to be open. Like we saw in the KC game, he's the guy that's going to be open and benefit from someone else getting double covered or a safety being shadowed over Diggs and all that kind of stuff. But I do think how you put it is exactly how it should be put. We can hope, not necessarily expect. I think hope is a better way to put it because it's all based on potential at this point with Gabe Davis. But them being a 1-2 combo that the league talks about. I think that's the best way to put it because Davis is growing. He's going to continue to grow. He's only 23 years old. He's still got plenty of time to grow into his ceiling, which is clearly unending at this point with the way he's committed to that growth mindset. But I think that's the best way to put it, that by the end of the season, these 2 guys are going to be looked at in a way where the Buffalo Bills might have the best wide receiver tandem in the league. And I think that's what we should be most excited about. Not necessarily that Gabe Davis is going to usurp or be the next Stefon Diggs when Stefon Diggs is no more in Buffalo, but more that he's going to be that piece to complement Stefon Diggs and they're going to be working together wholeheartedly towards that ultimate goal.
Yeah. And I agree with some of the stuff you said too. Like, the hardworking, even that first year with COVID and team meetings, we had heard he was, breaking down playbook for guys that had been on the team longer than him, and just getting into the playbook and all that stuff matters. You see all that and he does all the dirty work stuff. But what really gets me about his game is even in his limited time here in the league, he makes big plays. He makes big time catches, leaning over the sideline. The couple catches he made in Indy, obviously some of the catches in that KC game, but even just in like a regular middle of the season game, you just see him come down with something where it's either just away from his body or attacking the ball at the point of attack in the air. He has a knack for making big plays. And to me, that's one of those things that you can train as hard as you want. You can do all the things you want. You either have that or you don't. Like you can either make those plays or they'd never work out for you. And they always seem to work out for him, which is going to be a big benefit because he does all the other little fundamental things right. Like he's not just a guy that's going to come in my opinion, like an Isaiah McKenzie, where he's going to give you those splash plays here and there. I think that he gives you those splash plays, but then on a play-by-play basis, he seems to be getting more and more consistent every time we see him out on the field. So that's why I'm excited that he's building that foundation, but he's still a guy that can wreck a game at any point with a big play.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
And before we go further with this, I just wanted to, I pulled it up earlier. I wanted to say thank you, Sophia, for the donation. And guys, smash that like button. We're a couple likable guys, so let us know. All right, let's continue on. This is one I'm really interested to get your opinion on because in all the DMs and back and forth, I don't know that we've ever talked about the addition of Jamison Crowder into this lineup.
He's
So
not.
I was a huge Cole Beasley supporter, even with all the off the field conversations and things that happened last year. I was still on board. Like, hey, look, when the lights come on, this guy's a baller. He's a huge part of this offense. That slot position's a big deal for this offense.
Mm-hmm.
I love Cole Beasley. I would have liked to have retained him even last year. I thought he had a really good, after that injury, I thought he started to ramp back up. I thought he had a really nice playoffs, and I like what we saw out of him. I would have liked to have brought him back. That didn't work out. In my free agency, sort of looking around for what would be next at that position, I really didn't even think of Jamison Crowder at all in the process. But after the Bills did it, and this is going to sound so homer of me, after the Bills did it, I was like, yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Makes
Like,
sense.
if you're going to move away from a guy like this might be the most logical move that was available to the Bills at the time, to pull in a guy like Jamison Crowder, who maybe he's not as developed of a route runner, but I mean, there's not a lot of guys in the slot in the NFL right now that are able to do the type of route running that Cole Beasley is, but he's got some ability in that. He's got some speed. He's made plays in the NFL. He's had some production at this level. And same thing, he's only 29 years old. He's right. He's 4 months older than Stefon Diggs. And some of the lack of production is probably what's been around him the last couple of years. He's really, even when he was with Washington, there wasn't tons of great talent around him in Washington. It was a little bit dysfunctional, but just in 2019, he had 800 yards, 834 yards, and 6 touchdowns. I'm not saying he's going to come in and do that, but this is a productive wide receiver. Probably the best scenario where you lose a Cole Beasley and you bring in a vet that can hold down this slot position, hopefully at least for the year, maybe into the future. What are your thoughts on Jamison Crowder?
My initial thoughts and kind of where I'm standing right now is, my favorite thing about it is that we just got 75-80% of what Cole Beasley is in his final years in Buffalo at a fraction of the cost, like a big fraction of the cost, but we still got some of what Cole Beasley is. And to me, that's really exciting because, like you said, he wasn't necessarily a flashy, like, oh, look at this piece on free agency, he would be awesome in the Bills offense, but he's exactly what they needed. He's a staple of consistency, dependability. You know what you're going to get from a guy like Jamison Crowder. Not too high, not too low, but he's dependable. He's been a security blanket for bad quarterback play in New York and Washington. It's really exciting to think about what he can do in an offense like Buffalo, and obviously with a quarterback like Josh Allen. But my
and the 2
expectations,
receivers we just talked about, pulling right.
Yes, exactly. My expectations for him, though, aren't necessarily like Cole Beasley-esque, where he's going to be the, third down guru. He's just going to get all those first downs on third down, and he's going to get all the dirty yards and stuff like that. Sure, he might have better yak ability than Beasley. He might have better speed, but that lack of, I don't want to say lack because he's still a good route runner, but the trade-off in what you're getting, where you're getting some more speed and you're getting some more yak ability, you are losing a little bit in route running when comparing him relative to Cole Beasley. So I think we shouldn't expect him to just slide in and be a 1-for-1 replacement, like easy, no-brainer. This offense isn't going to lose a step, all that kind of stuff. We're going to get like 80% of what Cole Beasley was. And there's nothing wrong with that because we're getting it at a fraction of the cost. And that's why I'm most excited about Jamison Crowder. I think the biggest thing that actually might hamper Jamison Crowder this year is the fact that we might just play more 12 personnel this year, and the slot receiver just might not be on the field as much because that's not in the plans for the season. But obviously that's all waiting to pan out.
Yeah. Well, and one area where I think we may have a benefit is, one thing that used to drive me nuts was trying to get screens to Cole Beasley. And I think I'm much more happy to see that happen with Jamison Crowder.
Yeah.
And maybe another thing that will prevent him from that type of production that we saw from Cole Beasley, I'm going to just kind of pass the buck to you on this one and let you go off. Khalil Shakir. I know this is a guy you like. Now, this might need another sort of pumping of the brakes for fans. I don't know. Is he going to have more of a start to his career like Gabe Davis, where, hey, the lineup is good enough. He can sit back and develop, do some special team stuff. We don't need to open that toy up and get it out in the offense right away. Or are they going to say, hey, Jamison's not necessarily the future at this slot position. We need to start ramping this kid into the offense. Or maybe is he going to be too good in preseason to not find ways to get him on the field?
I think the first two things, it's going to be the first two things. Obviously, I can't speak to the future. We don't know how he's going to do in training camp and all that stuff. But I think it's exactly what you said with those first two things. I think it's going to be, I've said this before. It's crazy that you said this. It's going to be the Gabe Davis treatment. You know, this is a crowded room. It's going to be really tough for him to get snaps. But when he gets snaps, I have nothing but confidence for him to be opportunistic with those snaps. I think he's going to be limited, but he shows so much polish as a route runner, a technician, just mentally understanding the game at such a young age. And I mean, he was just so dominant at Boise State. Not only, I mean, he had good production as a punt returner as well, but as a slot receiver on the outside, Brandon Beane talked about how sure he could do some stuff on the outside, but that's probably not going to be his bread and butter in the league. He's got the release skills. We saw that at the Senior Bowl. He's got enough speed. We saw that from his combine performance. But I think what we can expect from him in year one is some special teams contributions, hopefully. Obviously, he's got to win that job. There's a lot to break down at punt returner and kick returner. I think we'll see him spell Jamison Crowder a little bit, to your point, where he's probably more viewed as the future at the slot wide receiver position. So you want to give him time to develop. You want to give him some time on task in games. So I think he'll spell Crowder a little bit, not necessarily take away from him, but that's all pending on performance. And then you might see him do some more gadget stuff and potentially take away from Isaiah McKenzie, because that's something that he actually did really well at Boise State. When he gets the ball in his hands, he's a running back. He's thick on the lower half. He is well built. He's a strong dude. He's like 6'205" or something like that. And he has really great contact balance with the ball in his hands. So I think finding ways to get the ball in his hands is a great thing for this offense. And he is truly a weapon, the same way that you talked about. Oh, you know, it wasn't great thinking about how to get Cole Beasley the ball on screens, and you were talking about it via Jamison Crowder.
Right.
Same thing can be said for Shakir. Shakir was a massive threat in the screen game for Boise State, and I think that's been an area for the Buffalo Bills offense that has yet to really thrive, that screen game, since Josh Allen has been here. They've tried to do it. It really hasn't gotten running at all, outside of maybe some John Brown audible screenplays.
Yes, I remember. Yeah, a couple of those.
But that's about it. There really hasn't been a lot of luck on those screenplays. So I think finding weapons like that, and we'll get to Tavon Austin later, guys like that to hopefully revive that portion of the offense is a goal.
Because that's honestly, we talk a lot about where's the yak in this offense, and part of it is now you had a guy like James Cook. You weren't getting that from running backs for the yak that increases team yak there in screen game. A lot of yak comes from yards after catch, comes from how plays are being called and developed and stuff like that. Like, you're going to get a bigger opportunity for yards after catch in a screen than you are going to on a 20-yard air yard ball from Josh Allen.
Intended air yards versus Mac Jones throws.
Right, exactly. Now, one thing on Shakir that I want to talk to you about. One, am I way off? I feel like a little bit of a homer whenever I compare or comp somebody towards a Bills player of the past, but he feels so Robert Woodsy to me. That when I watched him, I just saw like a kind of a Robert Woods, maybe not as much of a dog as Robert Woods in terms of like getting in there and blocking you, but just sneakier athletic than he looks, which Robert Woods was much faster, like a better returner than he looked, could take the top off of you, and just seemed to do all the right things whenever he was on the field. It just felt that way to me.
I think I've heard this comp a lot. I already forgot the comp that I had for him, since we're so far removed from draft season, but I've heard the comp a lot with Robert Woods, and I think for the reasons that you just explained, they're all fair, but I think the blocking portion of it is missing. I think like Robert Woods was an awesome blocker. You could see the effort on every single opportunity that he had. The thing with Shakir is like, sure, he's a good blocker when he has the effort, but the effort is hit or miss. And that's the biggest thing, where there's disparity in the comp just on that regard. But I think the specific points that you hammered home with that comp, I think that's true. He is deceptively athletic, and I think that has in part due to his intelligence for the position. And I think that goes the same for Robert Woods. The way they play the position is very intelligent, and it allows them to be deceptively athletic.
Yeah. Now, this is a question that I was going to follow up with you here, Ralph Wilson Sr. talking in our chat here. And if you're listening on the podcast, come over to YouTube sometime and hop in the chat. It's a pretty good time all the time here. So Shakir being groomed for number 2 so Davis can get paid by somebody else. I don't know if that's true, but my question is more, I look at this, we still have a couple guys to talk about, but I look at this core of this wide receiver group, and we'll talk about Isaiah McKenzie in a minute, but he doesn't really apply to this conversation. If something happens to, God forbid, I'm going to knock on some wood right now, Stefon Diggs or Gabe Davis, what do you do on the outside? That's the only thing that I see right now in this depth chart is moving Shakir out to the outside. And I think he can do that, but I don't know that is a strong suit or that you want to rely on that. Is he that option if something happens to, say, a Gabe Davis where they need a game of somebody else? Because it's not Jamison Crowder, it's not Isaiah McKenzie. We're not going to send Jake Kumaro out there ahead of any of these guys. Is that how it shakes out?
Yeah, that's what I'm looking at right now. Like I'm looking at guys that can play the outside. I'm looking at Kumaro, Stevenson, Shakir. And I think Shakir is your best option out of those guys. And yeah, like you said, it's not necessarily what you want him doing, but it is something he's capable of doing. He has the requisite speed. He understands how to run routes. He has a good release package, at least from what I saw at the Senior Bowl. You don't get a lot of that when you're playing the slot. You don't get pressed a lot when you're playing the slot or playing in college to that regard. But either way, he shows enough competency to play on the outside. He's not like a small guy. Like I said, he's 6 foot over 200. Yeah. So he has the physical traits to do it, but I think his skill set is just so much more suited for the slot. But yeah, looking at the roster, he's probably the best bet for being a backup to if one of those guys get injured. Once again, knock on wood. I mean, yeah, there aren't better options. It's crazy, but I was thinking maybe Kumaro, but yeah. Yeah, that's the only other one that I could really think of. I think it's
not great.
Shakir and Kumaro. No,
it's not great.
It's not a great idea to think about. We always talk about like bad problems or good problems to have. This is a bad problem.
It's not a good have. Yeah, absolutely. And now, so the next guy we're probably going to spend any significant time on, and we'll go through the bottom of this roster here, but the last one for significant time would be Isaiah McKenzie. Obviously, a fan favorite. Was able to showcase some ability in that New England game. I think that was way overstated and way overblown. The fact that Bill Belichick refused to remove Miles Bryant from man coverage with Isaiah McKenzie. I'm glad the Bills took advantage of that, and that was fun to dunk on them over and over again with that. I don't think that is indicative of who he is. I think it's similar to saying we want AJ Epinesa to play similar to how he played against the Dolphins week in and week out. It's like, yeah, if you could play against that Dolphins offensive line week in and week out, you'd lead the league in sacks. Like that would have been great. I don't think that's who he is as a player, but I think he did show he can do a little bit more than maybe a person like me was saying last year. I think he's probably somewhere in between where I was and where his super fans are that think he's the next great slot receiver. I think he's battling here as a bubble player at the bottom of this roster who's a limited dude who, if he doesn't win this return job, I feel like is not wasting a roster spot, but it's a very limited roster spot for last year. He had 26 targets, and that was 4.3% of the targets on the year. And so I have a tough time envisioning what his role is if he's needed with some of the stuff you talked about, Khalil Shakir being able to do. I think Crowder can add some of that to his game as well. Is this offseason shaping up as pushing him, Isaiah McKenzie, more to the bubble?
I think so. I mean, especially given the contract that he was handed out, like if he were to be cut, I believe it's just over $1 million in dead cap. So that's not ideal, but you can live with that. And I think, the best way to put it is if he's not going to win that return job, what is he other than slot depth? And I think that's
tough to carry on an active roster.
Exactly. Do you really want your sixth wide receiver to be slot depth, or your fifth, whatever it ends up being, fifth or sixth wide receiver? What if he makes the team? Is if he's just return depth and slot depth, what's the point of the roster spot, and where would it be more efficient to use that roster spot? Because it would take 2 injuries to get to him potentially. Obviously, we don't know how it's all going to pan out with Shakir and Crowder, but the way it looks, I think it looks like he is, I don't want to say the odd man odd man out, but he is on the bubble. Like, he really
That's tough.
does more than any year I think he's been in Buffalo. He has something to prove. And I think last year we talked about it with him versus Stevenson, but I think this year it's a lot steeper of a mountain to climb for him, because now he's competing with two guys, and he's competing with two guys at two different spots. You know, last year it was just Stevenson at wide receiver and returner, and Stevenson wasn't necessarily competing for a slot gig.
Right.
Now it's Shakir and Crowder competing for, we don't know how much Crowder's doing at punt return, but either way, hypothetically, it'd be Shakir and Crowder competing for return gig and slot gig.
And maybe Stevenson still. We're not going to write Stevenson out of the return game yet. And then, you know, to take that a step further here, a lot of people in the chat are talking about, you know, that Tavon Austin signing. And this one for me is a tough one, because I think I get really annoyed at signings like this. The name carries way more weight than the player's production has. He just has not lived up to the amazing high school highlights, and then the great college career that he had. Whether he talked about injuries, and I'm sure some of the quarterback play that he had to deal with played into that, but we're talking about a guy that's at the twilight of his career. I think this is hey, we wanted more depth. We got rid of an undrafted free agent. Come on in the summer. See if maybe you can land here. Maybe we're just going to give you an opportunity to flash in the preseason and land your last contract somewhere else. But is Tavon Austin competing with Isaiah McKenzie, or was that like to push Isaiah McKenzie? Is there a path to the roster for Tavon? Because both, for me, McKenzie and Austin somewhat feel redundant with Crowder and Shakir.
Yeah, I think if anything, it's a wake-up call for McKenzie. I think it is. It's another guy to push McKenzie to make this roster. I think, Austin's path to make the roster is McKenzie's spot. And like I said, it's already bleak thinking about McKenzie being a third slot option on this team as is. And that is what Tavon Austin would be. He would be a third. I mean, he could probably do a little bit of stuff on the outside because of his speed, but
sure,
he's a little bit smaller. You don't know how he's going to handle press coverage and all that stuff, but he's another guy that could potentially compete for return gig, gadget stuff, slot stuff. So it's just another guy that falls into that same bucket of, all right, now we got four guys competing for these spots.
Another guy that could get in that mix for some of that gadget stuff is James Cook. Right. Like that's another guy that can take into some, hey, we don't need a gadget guy for 8 touches. We've got a running back 3 or 2, however you want to put them, that can get those touches and do the same types of things for us.
Right.
That just makes it seem weird at the bottom of this portion of the roster. A guy I think is a lock at the bottom of the roster, but not as a wide receiver, but he's listed as wide receiver. Jake Coomer, I think, is a special teams lock for this team. I think he slots in there, and he gives you exactly what you don't have in Isaiah McKenzie, which is he is your wide receiver. I think the team likes him, and I think around the NFL, he's considered fine for wide receiver 6, right? But he gives you legitimate special team snaps and will be a core special teams player for you throughout the entire season, and will probably be up in the team lead for snaps at special teams if you make him part of your active roster. So to me, he's a lock at this position.
I'll echo that. I think that's absolutely valid. Yeah, you need to have someone contributing on special teams from this position. If it's not at returner, you need it somewhere else as well. And we don't know who the gunners are going to be on this team, and he's someone that did some of that last year. So you definitely have value on that. And not only just the special team stuff, but we just spent so much time talking about how deep it is at the slot position at wide receiver. And you asked what happens if, Diggs or Davis goes down. Kumaro was one of those names that came up as a potential option to slide in on the outside if, next man up, God forbid, if that happens. Kumaro is that guy. He's one of those guys that can do that. It's really thin at boundary wide receiver for the Bills right now. So not only do you need him for that special team stuff, but you need him as that insurance policy.
Yeah, for sure. Maybe one of the most disappointing things over the last few years is Isaiah Hodgins not just, I mean, even this week in OTAs, we saw him off on the sidelines with Shakir and a couple of the other guys who are working their way through injuries. It's such an unfortunate thing. I was talking to another dad on the way to school today. We were walking on the way to school and talking about how, Tom Brady got the opportunity because of Drew Bledsoe's injury. And we started talking about players in basketball and football who either injuries just derailed any semblance of a career or just never were able to get out of the way. And it's feeling that way
it is
right now for him, where again, this OTAs, you're just seeing a guy who has really not ever seen the field with the Buffalo Bills since getting here. I liked the idea of the draft pick a lot.
Same.
Again, though, we're talking about slot depth, and you're adding a guy that is a different version of slot depth in that big slot role. But man, it seems like this is a far-fetched idea that we're ever going to see him in a Buffalo Bills uniform or contribute to this team in any way. And I just feel bad because it's not like he came out and performed poorly and didn't live up to the hype. He just has not been able to stay healthy. It's tough. I feel for him. Do you see a scenario where he balls out this summer and can find himself on this active roster?
I mean, if he finds himself on the active roster, it's two things. One, it's because he's healthy, and two, because he does stuff on the outside that differentiates himself from others already on the roster. I think the appeal to him early on was that, he could be that big power slot type of guy, but now it's at the point where we're kind of going to need your big body to do something on the outside, but does he have the requisite speed and acceleration to do that on the outside, or is his ultimate role going to be that power slot, someone who can operate as a quasi tight end, some of the stuff that Gabe Davis did early on, but kind of at a watered down value. So it's really tough to see his path to the roster. Super unfortunate because I was equally as excited. His tape coming out of college was fun. A lot of production, a lot of
he even had a good start to that. He and Gabe had a great start to that training camp, and then he got hurt and just we hadn't seen him since.
So it's going to be an uphill battle for him. I think if he makes his team, it's going to be practice squad. I think that's where he's going to find his place. I wouldn't think other teams are going to take a chance on anything like that, but the Bills know what they have in him. Yeah. Exactly. The Bills know what they have in him, so they probably feel pretty confident that they could just stash him on the practice squad if they feel good about what he is when he's healthy, and then
hope you get him healthy. Right.
Exactly.
Now to finish this off, any of the undrafted guys they brought in, does anyone left on this depth chart do anything for you? I think if we're talking about Tavon Austin having a tough path to making this roster, and we're talking about Hodgkins being practice squad, I can't see anyone coming out of nowhere and just having the type of summer that would get them one of these spots.
Yeah, I think no, not really. The only name that needs to be mentioned, I think, is Marquez Stevenson, because Marquez Stevenson, if he wins the return job and shows that he can do enough on the outside as a receiver on the boundary, then he will have something to hang his hat on. And I think the boundary stuff combined with the return stuff will be valuable to the Buffalo Bills, because we know usually Sean McDermott, whoever's going to be the return guy, for whatever reason, he doesn't like to use them a lot on whatever side of the ball that they play on. So if Stevenson makes this team as the return guy, he doesn't have to be relied on, obviously, as a primary boundary guy. But if he shows that he can do that, it's added value, it's bonus value. And I think he's really the only guy left. I mean, you could argue that same type of path for Tanner Gentry, but I think it's more likely.
I feel like he's just there because Josh likes.
Yeah, a little bit of nepotism.
Yeah, that's why Matt Barkley's here too. All right, one last question on this wide receiver room. So I was looking at the targets for last year, and just I know I've seen Greg tweeting about it and having this conversation. Got me thinking, is something I want to ask you, right? So we had Stefon Diggs took up 26.3% of the targets a year ago. Cole Beasley took up 17.6%. Dawson Knox got 11.8%. Emmanuel Sanders got 11.3%. Gabe Davis got 10.7%. Devin Singletary 8%. Moss 5%. McKenzie 4%. And then the remaining 5% was Sweeney, Breida, Kumaro, Gilliam, and Deion Dawkins was in there. But so you're losing Beasley, you're losing Sanders. That's almost 30% of your targets a year ago. Clearly Davis is going to get some of that Sanders work. That's what he was replacing as he came in anyway. So I think you can expect to see him maybe go up from the 10 he had last year to 11, 12, maybe 13% of the targets himself as that number 2 receiver. You still have that roughly 15, 17% that Beasley is. We talked about it a little bit. Is Jamison Crowder going to come in and take that 15% of targets from this offense, or is that going to get split up and divvied up? And then, I know we're talking about the wide receivers, but where does Dawson Knox's continued development in this? I would like to see him be a, 100 target kind of guy this year in this offense and be that number 2 or 3 option in the offense. Right. Where does James Cook? And we know what they want to do with him. How does he take away from this? And OJ Howard. So sort of how do you see this pie chart of the ball? There's only one ball, and we got a lot of guys we just talked about. Do you see anything changing at the top for Diggs? Who do you see kind of getting into this mix?
Yeah, I don't think we're going to see much change from the top with Diggs. I do think we'll see a little bit more with Davis, obviously increased opportunity for targets. So I think he'll definitely see more of that percentage. But I think that remaining 30%, I don't think Crowder's going to 1-for-1 get that. What was it? 17 from
17
Beasley.
for Beasley.
I think it's going to fall. He's going to fall somewhere between like probably 12 and 15, probably closer to the 12 side of things. And then I'd like to see, like you said, Dawson Knox will probably get up probably to the 13 ballpark. Then you got to mix in Cook there too. I think Cook is being overhyped in terms of how much he's going to get in the receiving role. Obviously, that's where he's probably going to contribute right away, like immediately, and where he'll be most comfortable. But I don't think he's going to like command targets from the offense. I don't think they're going to be like, yeah, we got to get this guy, 10 targets a game or anything like that. Like, they'll probably try to game plan him like 3 touches in the passing game or something like that. But I think we're going to see more from Cook, Howard, and Knox. I think that's the big thing that's going to take away from Crowder, and maybe like sprinkle in a little bit of Shakir there. Yep. That's going to be the main reason that Crowder doesn't get to 17. It's going to be because Knox is going to get more development wise. We're going to see more 12 personnel, at least as I'm projecting. So OJ Howard, perfect timing, Sophia.
Yeah, Sophia.
OJ Howard is going to get a little bit more of that, eat into the Crowder stuff. And then you're going to get some gadgetry or some screens with Cook and Shakir, all that kind of stuff. So it's going to take that 17 from Beasley and probably push Crowder down towards the 12, 13 ballpark. That's my projection, at least.
I will say, if you're making roster projections, talking like this, we sort of squeezed out McKenzie's 4% in this a little bit. Like
we did.
It's the more I think about it, the more I talk about it, I'm just saying, be prepared for it. All the people that love them. I don't want to wish anybody bad. I hope that everyone succeeds. But any other final thoughts here on this wide receiver room, on this position group here going into the next year?
I'm excited. I'm excited to see the growth from the room. I'm excited to see the utilization from the room. And that goes for the James Cooks of the world, the Khalil Shakirs, how OJ Howard is going to be involved with 12 personnel. I'm excited to see what Ken Dorsey's vision for what the identity of this offense is going to be. We know it's not going to change a lot. We know there's going to be, ultimately a lot of the same stuff because of him being here with Daboll through the
and knowing what Josh likes. Yeah,
exactly. All that kind of stuff. But I am interested to see if he has a specific identity in mind or utilization for certain players. That's just a different wrinkle from what Daboll did. So I'm excited, but I'm also very interested.
Yeah. The thing I think that I'm most excited about in terms of what you're talking about and how Dorsey's going to use this group and this offense is, again, we've heard so much about yards after catch this offseason. It really, that was one of the things Josh Allen specifically pointed out that he was working on in this offseason is how to get more out of that. And there's so much a quarterback can do. It's somewhat a quarterback driven stat, but there's a lot that goes into it. And I think we're going to see Dorsey trying to find ways to get these receivers the ball to create with the ball in their hand, especially when, again, the kind of guys we've talked about that they've added to this team and the difference from the guys that were here last year, I think gives you an opportunity to, if you can get them in space, screen game, things like that. So that's what I'm interested to see is how do they get the ball in their playmakers' hands and allow them to make plays and not relying on Josh to put 20-yard intended air yards all the time and get more out of the receivers in the yards after catch. Kendall, you're fantastic.
Thank you, man.
I am going to keep doing the show with Greg, but if anything ever happens to Greg, I might have to call you up and make you my host. I loved having you on the show here, man. For anyone that's not following Kendall, let us know, where can people find you? I know you do a lot with the Air Raid Hour guys and you're on the film room. Tell people where they can find you because you're one of the best up and coming content creators I know.
Thanks, man. Appreciate that. So if anyone isn't following me on Twitter, you can find me at Mirsky Kendall. That is my handle on Twitter. Just my first name, last name, first name. Got it backwards there. And then you can find me every week on the film room. On Tuesdays, I'm trying to do timing wise. It's
a
7 p.m.
Yep.
East Coast. It's difficult here. I'm on Mountain Time.
Nobody else lives in Mountain Time.
No one lives in
the world does not live in Mountain Time. Yes.
But yeah, we're on Tuesdays every week. We haven't decided yet what we're doing this week for film session, but I'm sure it's going to be a fun one. And then obviously, as I alluded to earlier, it's a dead point in the off season. So I'm trickling around. I'm fiddling with some things that I want to do. And I've been toying with this idea of the Madden cast, trying to get the virtual Madden side to things on the YouTube, on the Cover One YouTube, see how much of an appetite Bills Mafia has for that. I'll be entering week 2 this week against the Washington football team, because this is last season that I'm replaying, not the Commanders yet, but I'll be playing week 2 with my fantasy drafted team. I guess check out the latest links from that to see who I drafted. I'm not going to go through everyone I drafted right now. But yeah, if you're interested, join me on Sunday for that to see if I can spank the Commanders like I did the Steelers last week. Hopefully they're a little bit more competitive this week and it'll be more fun for everyone.
Love to see that, man. Yeah. And guys, make sure that not just Kendall, you're following everybody here on the Cover One Podcast Network. Tons of great shows. We got the Roundup, like I mentioned, the Air Raid Hour. Those guys are killing it. Going Deep's coming up this week. The Hoof, those guys are going to be coming back around. Obviously, the Film Room. The great thing about the Film Room, so like our show here is not super evergreen. This is our most evergreen content that we make is these positional previews, because you have the next month or so you can go and consume that. But the Film Room stuff, man, I find myself sometimes where I'm looking for something to watch, going back. They'll pop up on my YouTube feed of some older Film Room thing, and I'm like, hey man, that's still good content. So make sure you're catching that. Disguise Coverage was right on here before us. Anthony killing it as always, obviously always crushing it. Make sure you're following everybody here at the Cover One Network, the main accounts, wherever you get your social media. Make sure you're following that. Get to our website. If you're not a premium subscriber, get into it. You can get access to our Slack channel, access to great stuff. We were watching the match the other night with a bunch of the premium subscribers here, just kind of chatting it up. So that's awesome. Great access over at the premium side. Make sure you're checking out the website. Definitely want to get in that Slack channel here as training camp ramps up and as we get into another fun season with the Buffalo Bills here, guys. Other than that, I appreciate everyone that joined tonight, everyone in the live chat. Thank you. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, get that little notification bell checked, and make sure that you're getting all the Cover One content coming to you whenever we go live. On behalf of Kendall Mirsky, I'm Aaron Quinn. Thank you for watching Cover One Buffalo, and we are